Let's get into one of the big issues, or the big issue for you right now, the Indigenous voice to Parliament. Part of your opposition has been that Australians should not be divided on race. You're now Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians. It's the only race, if you like, that has its own minister and Shadow Minister. Isn't that a form of dividing by race already, just having that role?
Well, I guess for me in this role, and what I've always sort of been focused on, is supporting those who are our most marginalised. I certainly don't view all Indigenous Australians as being marginalised inherently because of our race, but I know that there's a lot of work, obviously, that needs to be done for those that are marginalised. And you know, in my previous work at the Centre for Independent Studies, you know, we looked hard at where the most marginalised exist and where the gap is sort of the widest. And from that, we know that there are those whose second language, you know, whose second or third language is their traditional language. Their first language is not English. Those in regional, remote communities where there are less availability for services. So for me, my focus has been about ensuring that they are the people, they are the Australian citizens we want to lift up and ensure that they have the same opportunities as other Australians, including other people of Indigenous heritage in our country who have same opportunities as those who aren't Indigenous in our country.
So I guess that, repeating my first question and sort of segueing to that, you are saying, you know, you're rightfully pointing out that we do have many Indigenous Australians a part of the most disadvantaged, the most marginalised in Australia. So whilst ideally we wouldn't treat anybody differently, isn't it a fact we need to because of this entrenched disadvantage, and the fact that we have your role as Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians shows that we do need to treat people differently to stop the poor outcomes that have been happening?
Yeah, look, I think in the long term, like in the immediate term, it is about addressing those issues with a bit of honesty, which I don't think we have done for some time. I don't think we've looked at where the money has been spent and looked at the organisations that exist to alleviate disadvantage and understand, well, where can it be better spent? What is working and what isn't working? We haven't really done an audit sort of process. And they're the sorts of things that I would certainly like to look at. In the long term, I wouldn't like to entrench in our constitution the idea of disadvantage, which I think is what the voice will do. It'll suggest that we will forever require special measures, require even a Minister for Indigenous Australians. Ultimately, what the end goal would be is to not have to have those sorts of special measures, that we would in fact treat everyone equally. I know in the Northern Territory there isn't in fact a Minister for Indigenous Australians. So if one day my role would become redundant, that would actually be a good thing. But until then, I wouldn't be looking to seeking to you know, entrench that within our constitution, but work on that gap so we don't have it.
Do you support constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution, the other part of the referendum question?
Yeah, look, recognition is something that I have supported throughout this, but unfortunately with what we're going to in this referendum, that's an element of it, but the other element of it is this bureaucratic structure, which I think is divisive and it's dangerous and it undermines democracy as we know it. But when it comes to recognition, absolutely, I can get behind that. But also I'd like to recognise the fact that, well, we are Australian citizens also, so therefore there is recognition of us within the Constitution. But ultimately, yeah, I support the recognition element. I just can't support the voice proposal that the Albanese government's put up.
You said I can get behind that. Is that recognition there that you weren't previously necessarily supporting this, but it is Shadow Cabinet's position, so you've had to support it now? Is that what's happened there, or did you support it a little while ago? Can you clarify exactly your position?
Oh, no. I've always been very, vocal and public about the fact that I do support recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution. And if that's all that we were doing in this referendum, that is certainly something that I would support. But it's the fact that the voice is attached to it, the concept of the voice, which we don't know what it really means for Australians. All that we know is that it'll mean that Indigenous Australians get to have an extra say over certainly policy that will affect all of Australia, and it will, within our constitution, as I believe, divide us along the lines of race. But the recognition element, absolutely. Okay. I've always been open about that.
Are you conscious of running the No campaign in a way that doesn't divide Indigenous Australians or indeed Australians? Because ultimately, the No and the Yes sides want the same thing. They want better outcomes. They want to close the gap. They think it should be done in very different ways. Do we need to have a high-minded debate about this and do as little damage as possible to cohesion?
Well, I think what's unfortunate about this referendum so far is it's already proved to be a divisive referendum. I mean, the rhetoric that's coming from the Yes campaign is to suggest that anyone who opposes it is racist is nonsense, and that in itself is absolutely divisive. The fact that the proponents of the Voice will attack individuals and not actually stick to the debate itself and prove that somehow their proposal is worthy of getting behind, that in itself I think is divisive, which is why, again, I think the ultimate outcome, if this were to be successful, would divide us as a nation along the lines of race. And for me, that means my own family. That means, I have a white Australian father, an Aboriginal mother. So then half my family are going to get an extra say over our nation, what goes on within our nation. Well, that's proposed, that's the proposal, but we're not sure how that's supposed to happen. And yet the other half sit back and go, righto, well, you'll make, the Voice will make determinations about policies that impact us all.
We appreciate your time. I'm very early on in the job. I'm sure we'll speak again in the lead up to this referendum. Senator, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Tom.